I have gotten a sense this week of that scripture reading from Isaiah that I am lifted up as if on wings of eagles. I feel as though I've been lifted up as if on the wings of APCE this week. I appreciate your praying with me as we have been talking and doing Bible study and doing worship and sermon. I appreciate and feel your prayers, so thank you very much. It's been a joy to be in your company. The scripture reading this morning is from the Gospel of Mark, perhaps one of the most fearful texts in this book of good news. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be afraid. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He's not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell Peter and his disciples that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is the word of the Lord.
And we, princess, are supposed to live happily ever after.
Says who?
Do you know? I don't know.
I know. We started saying it the moment the proclamation about Jesus was declared to be good news. If it starts out good news, if people proclaim it to be good news, if it carries on like good news, then it ought to end up being good news forever after. Good doesn't just start out being good. Good is good right up until the end. When I was growing up, there was this commercial that got it right. Maxwell House Coffee. I've never drunk coffee. To this day, I do not drink coffee. However, there is still this affirmation in the back of my mind that if I had drunk coffee, if I still drank coffee, I am sure I would be drinking Maxwell House Coffee, because I was convinced by their commercials that Maxwell House Coffee was what? Good to the last drop. Isn't that what good is supposed to be? Not first sip good, not first few gulps good, not good just when it is piping hot, but good even when it cools off. Like the hot chocolate at Starbucks. I love that stuff because it's good when it's hot and it's never too hot. It's good because it's just right hot. It goes down so smooth. The taste of that melted, buttery chocolate just paints the inside of my esophagus with a silky, dreamy, cocoa-y taste that spills lovingly into my stomach and spreads like rich, liquid auburn satin blooming out into a velvety brown desert rose in my tummy. Just warming it, filling it, enriching it. That's good. And that stays good. And that goodness changes, but the goodness stays even as the chocolate cools and it doesn't warm me as much. It's still chocolate. It still tastes silky, dreamy, cocoa-y sweet. It's good to the last drop, and that's how good ought to be. What starts out good ought to stay good, not just until the end, but even after, ever after the end. The early church certainly thought so. This Jesus story started out a good story, the proclamation of the inbreaking of the future reign of God and the present turmoil of human history, ushered in place for us by God's own Son. Was he really God's Son? Was the news really that good? Well, we asked for some identification. Jesus had to prove he was God enough to gain access to the benefits of human respect. Jesus' identification of lordship then came from his demonstration of power, the healings, the exorcisms, the teaching like nothing anybody had ever heard before. Every moment of his unfolding life and ministry offered more proof that he was who people claimed he was, the realization of God's presence and God's inbreaking future kingdom right here in the midst of our present human living. Yes, that's good news. Actually, that's great news. And what starts out good news, if it really is good, if it ever was good, has to end up good news. So when Mark opens his Jesus story by declaring that it is the good news of Jesu Christu, the Son of God, we expect that no matter what happens in the middle of the story, he will close his story with the realization that it's still good news. I'm reminded of a scene from the movie A Princess Bride. The movie has all the moves of a good story at the beginning. A handsome young man named Wesley, a beautiful young lady named Buttercup, and true love, the bond between them. Despite all the despicable things that happen to them, there is the sense throughout that what starts good will end good. Though separated from each other, we are certain, particularly because this is a children's story and a kindly grandfather has chosen to read it to his sick grandson, that it will be a good to the last drop story. The movie switches between the grandfather reading the story to his grandson and the actual perils that befall Wesley and Buttercup. To be sure, there is desperate, difficult, disturbing stuff throughout the story. What makes the story tolerable is our certainty that in the end, Wesley and Buttercup's love will win out and they will live happily ever after. Then comes that point in the movie that stuns the grandson and us movie viewers. It appears that the evil king ends up getting his wish instead. The evil king has appeared to send Wesley off into some permanent exile and then even death. He has captured Buttercup. He has convinced her that Wesley will never come for her and that it is time for her to give Wesley up and marry him. And yet right up to the moment of the narrated wedding, we are certain that true love will win out. That it will be Wesley and Buttercup who are married. The evil king will not force Buttercup to marry him. No way. But then, inconceivably, the wedding between Buttercup and the evil king actually appears to happen. Those of us in the audience, and certainly the grandson in his sick bed, are flat out stunned.
You read that wrong. She doesn't marry Humperdinck, she marries Wesley. I'm just sure of it. After all that Wesley did for her, if she didn't marry him, it wouldn't be fair.
Well, who says life is fair? Where is that written? Life isn't always fair.
I'm telling you, you're messing up the story. Now get it right.
Do you want me to go on with this?
Yes.
All right, then. No more interruptions. At noon, she met her subjects again, this time as their queen.
No, the grandfather cannot possibly be reading the story right. Because Buttercup can't be marrying the king. That is not how good news works. If it starts out good news, it has to end up good news, or somebody has to change the way the story ends. Precisely. Think of it this way. The early church is the annoyed grandson who has the wherewithal to make the story in the right way. The early church rewrites Mark's ending until it feels good, until Mark's story ending feels the way the early church thought it ought to feel. Here's the problem with the early church, and for us, the latter-day church. The gospel that begins famously, the good news of Jesu Christu, the Son of God, ends up at chapter 16, verse 8, with the Son hung to death on a tree, his male followers scattered, and the last hope for fulfilling the Son's wishes of carrying his message to the world, his women followers, running off into the night scared witless. This is how Mark intended his story of the good news of Jesus Christ to end. Commentator D.E. Nineham, like most scholars, is convinced the undisputed facts are that everything that follows 16:8 in any surviving manuscript can confidently be declared non-Markan on grounds of attestation, style, and content. Thus, the gospel in its earliest form in which we can trace it ended right there at 16:8. But the story that ends in 16:8 is anything but good to the last drop. In fact, from the moment the opening curtain drops, goodness rushes off the stage, flees blindly out into the narrative desert, and falls off a cliff. Jesus is driven into the wilderness. Jesus comes out of the wilderness, and in one of the great examples of a bad hire, actually 12 successive bad hires, he takes on disciples who will disappoint and desert him. Jesus is hounded by the masses seeking his powers. Jesus is hunted by the authorities who want to stop him from using his powers. Ultimately, the masses turn on Jesus, the authorities detain Jesus, and the good news story ends up being a crucifixion headline with a front page lead about an empty tomb. Any hope that the story that started so good can possibly end up good has just dropped through the floor. Now, something has to be done to clean up the mess of the ending Mark's story has made. I call it the Walt Disney effect. Over the past decades, I have paid big money to go to the movies to see cartoons. My son and daughter once loved them, so Sharon and I loved them. We cheered for Ariel and the Little Mermaid, for Belle and Beauty and the Beast, for Tarzan and, well, Tarzan, for Simba and the Lion King, for Aladdin and Aladdin, and for Elsa and Anna in Frozen. And on it goes. And what makes them special, especially for children and for parents, are the happy endings. Walt Disney has for several generations now been in the business of making children and their parents believe, if just for a moment, that there is such a thing as happily ever after. Part of our faith in Walt Disney Studios and Walt Disney theme parks and the whole Walt Disney ethos is the ability of Disney to make us believe in happy endings, and then especially for children to somehow transfer that belief to our own fragile, often very tragic lives. And when our own lives don't turn out that way, well, we say, well, after all, those were only children's stories. But it's a different story when we consider the story about Jesus. Because our faith in the outcome of our lives is so often tied up in the outcome of his life, we need to believe in a happy ending for him and his story. Well, if not happy, at least victorious. What if the happiness ever after, the victory after defeat, isn't so clear-cut? Such is the case with the way the Gospel of Mark originally ended at the 8th verse of chapter 16. As Ched Myers so aptly puts it in his commentary, it's not a happy ending in which all is resolved. The early Christians were like the latter-day Walt Disney aficionados. They couldn't abide by such a curt, stark, open ending. They needed happiness. They needed victory. They needed triumph. They needed a few more verses. So they supplied them. They supplied the kind of ending they figured Mark would have supplied had he understood the kind of consternation his kind of ending ultimately caused. They fiddled around until they got the ending of Mark just right. They added verses about snake handling and resurrection appearances and faithful disciples in verses 9 through 20 so the story could end happily ever after, so the story could be good to the last drop. You know what they did? They betrayed Mark. This is what Ched Myers means when he argues the dilemma in the ending is precisely what Mark refuses to resolve for us. He means to leave us to wrestle with whether the women are not at the tomb, that is to say us, overcame their fear in order to proclaim the new beginning in Galilee. To provide a neat closure, he goes on to say, to the narrative would allow the reader to remain finally passive. The story would be self-contained and no need of a readerly response. In other words, in the language of this week, we wouldn't have to get on the boat. The need for the reader is to respond. Myers is arguing that Mark's ending is an intentional literary ending, an invitation for his readers, for us to respond to what has happened at the end of the Jesus story. Discipleship is about a response, not just the discipleship of the disciples, but the discipleship of us readers. Mark understands that one of the primary obstacles that keeps us from doing discipleship is fear. We tell people, do not be afraid, so as to suggest that they can and they should overcome their fear. By the way Mark ends his gospel, he seems to be telling us to get ready to live with that fear, to live with it and to respond through it. So instead of comforting, fear-reducing, resurrection appearances that assure the women disciples and all us men and women readers that in the end everything worked out the way it was supposed to, Mark gives us emptiness. You know how emptiness makes you feel. An empty stomach makes a person fearful for his survival. An empty wallet makes a person fearful for her future. An empty mind makes a person so dangerous that everyone in his wake fears for him and for themselves. An empty tomb instead of a risen body makes a disciple fearful that her teacher's body has been stolen by thieves and her teacher's mission has been abandoned by God. Do not fear. Yeah, right. Emptiness forces you to fear. Empty stomach, empty wallet, empty mind, empty sanctuary, empty church classroom. Mark understands, God understands. That is why the final lesson God teaches through the Mark curriculum is a lesson about emptiness and responding to it. The emotional content of 16:1 through 8 is fear. In fact, in describing the fear of the women, Mark uses the same verbs he used in describing the fearful reaction of the disciples to Jesus' plan to lead them into Jerusalem. You remember, Mark says Jesus and his disciples were going up the road to Jerusalem. Jesus was out front leading them, and they were mesmerized. After all, given all the trouble he was in with the authorities in Jerusalem who were plotting to kill him, he was still walking right into Jerusalem. How did the disciples respond to what Jesus was doing, where Jesus was going, where Jesus was taking them? Mark says they were afraid. Discipleship fear is appropriate not only to the ending of Mark's gospel, discipleship fear is appropriate to the whole entire gospel. There might not be goodness to the last drop, but there is fear to the last drop. Fear is the natural reaction to a discipleship whose content is the way of the cross. Anybody who truly understands what it means to be a disciple of Jesus is afraid. If you're not afraid, you don't understand. And this is why Mark doesn't want to stress resurrection appearances that will wipe out the fear with a victorious ending. He stresses the call and the challenge in the midst of emptiness, which that call represents. He is about calling faithful disciples to walk through the empty darkness, not comfortable Christians who want to glory triumphantly in the presence of the light. Therefore, resurrection appearances would be out of place even at the end for Mark. An ending about fearful discipleship fits a gospel presentation filled with disciples who are afraid. So John Dominic Crossan concludes, Jesus does not return in apparitions to save his own from danger. Instead, Mark offers us an absent Jesus. On earth, there are no apparitions, but only the harsh negative of an empty tomb. And the Lord, who is not here. Look at what Mark is doing. Like a mad scientist who thinks he can conjure lead into gold, Mark is trying to transfigure fear into discipleship. The women go to the tomb, a customary act with which the readers would be familiar, but then Mark gives us that narrative reversal. Instead of being praised for their actions, the young man dressed in white challenges them. Why? Because Jesus isn't there, and Jesus' absence says something about the kind of presence we should be demonstrating in the world. The young man tells the women to push through their fear and go meet Jesus and go tell the world about Jesus, but they don't. They are too afraid. They're not paralyzed by fear. They're energized by fear to run fast and far away. And with this very unexpected bad ending, Mark has issued a very powerful narrative challenge to us readers who are afraid for this ending, to us. As Norman Peterson writes in his article on Mark's ending, the narrator's unexpected withdrawal from communication with the reader is such that the reader is compelled by the narrator to respond. Respond. How? by doing what the young man told the women to do, by going to meet the risen Jesus with the intention of finishing in our world the mission Jesus started in his Galilee. What the men and women disciples could not do, Mark wants us, his readers, to fight through the emptiness, fight through the fear, and finish Jesus' story. Sometimes when things are not going the way we think they ought to be going, especially for us faithful believers in the lordship of Jesus Christ, when we hurt more than we think we should, when we suffer more than we think we should, when we are beset by obstacles more than we think we should, when we cry more than we think we should, we want to rise up and tell God, you are not working this story out right. When that moment comes, we must resist the urge to try and rewrite God's story. We don't rewrite the ending. We are the ending. How we respond is critical. God has given us the assurance God gave the women, not in convincing fashion, just like the women weren't convinced by that young man, but we have the scriptures. We have the faith of folk across the centuries. We have the existence of a church that has survived all the stupid stuff we Christians have done to it and in the name of it. All of that is God's way of saying to us what the angel said to those women: he is risen. Go tell his story. Go live his story. Go finish his story. He has gone out there before you. Follow. Finish. While others have scattered out of fear, we are called not to make the ending feel good by talking good about it, but to insert ourselves into the moment with all the energy, faith, and resolve we can muster when we teach. There is hope out there in front of us. Not in the form of Christian education looking the way we want Christian education to look in the future, but looking the way God would have it look. Follow that promise. Trust that promise. Teach in the embrace of that promise, and let God take care of the rest. I think that is what Jesus is trying to get across to the disciples on the boat when he asked them, why are you afraid? Why are you afraid to trust God, to let God take care of us, even when the horizon appears empty of God's presence and protection? You know, the more I think about it, the more I think that in this time in the church's history, in this time in the history and life of Christian education in the church, we, after all we have been through, after all the centuries of church building and mission and faith and theology and exegesis and archaeology and teaching, we find ourselves right back at the empty tomb. This moment in which we find ourselves fearful about our future and the future of Christian education, fearful about the future of the church itself, is our empty tomb moment. Consider, Jesus' ministry and death is behind us. The church is scattering, breaking up from within as theological and practical disputes shatter traditional, denominational, and other communal bonds. Breaking up from pressures outside as a wind of secularization blows through contemporary culture, shaking the foundations of our faith as many, especially the young, find different forms of spirituality to be the pathway to the transcendent. And while all of this is happening around us, as we wonder about our role as disciples of Jesus who was crucified, we find ourselves in an oddly similar thematic place. For the disciples in the first century, it appears Jesus has lost. His death seems to be convincing evidence that God was not as supportive of his ministry as Jesus thought God was. The religious authorities who opposed him, called him possessed of Satan, who made odd alliances even with the Romans, have not only deposed him, embarrassed him, they have destroyed him. From every indication, it looks like he lost. We look around today, and though there is no crucifixion in our immediate past, the picture of our faith present, our institutional faith present, can appear fairly empty and bleak. It feels sometimes like Jesus' church is losing now too, being squeezed out of its traditional place of leadership in society and spiritual formation and family life. On the way to the tomb that first Easter morning, I see the women walking past the tracks of disciples who have scattered, who have run every direction except toward the broken body of their former teacher. On the way to church on most Sunday mornings, I drive past the bodies of men and women and children enjoying their lives on a Sunday morning, walking and biking and running in every direction except toward a church, school, or a worship service. It feels bleak. Sometimes these gorgeous Sunday mornings, full of sunshine, full of vibrant people, being vibrant, out in the streets, in the parks, in the restaurants, in their homes, not in our churches. I suspect, despite the many, many differences between me and those first Easter morning women, I wonder if we don't share a similar thought. What happened? It was all going so well. What in the world happened? In front of us now is negation, as was negation facing the women. It wasn't just that Jesus was dead. Jesus wasn't even there. The tomb was empty, nothing there. Well, wait, a young man, apparently though not a convincing young man because he can't keep the women on track, can't keep their fear from taking control of them. We have that kind of emptiness too. The presence of the risen Lord, to be sure, with us here, just as he was with the women at that empty tomb. But that wasn't enough to keep them from running, because a risen presence isn't a physically present presence. And sometimes to keep the fear at bay, you need a thing. You need a person you can see and touch to make you sure. And they didn't have that. We don't have that. What do we have? Empty tomb, empty sanctuaries, empty classrooms, empty place in society. But they did have that sign. They had that odd young man sitting in a tomb. Who hangs around an empty tomb anyway? In our zombified, undead popular culture, a strange character hanging out in a tomb would be enough to freak us out. But the message of the young man was the only positive moment in this episode filled with negation. He tells them, he assures them that despite everything that has happened, despite everything that they now see, despite the fact that they are in a place of the dead, that Jesus is alive. Jesus' mission and ministry is alive, and they are to take their living place with him and his ministry by leaving the place where his corpse should be and heading to the place where his risen presence will be. This story isn't over. Despite how it looks, this story is just beginning. And they are the ones to carry it on and finish it. In this time of negation for the present church, I wonder if the same message is reverberating across the centuries and reaching out from the empty tomb to us in this place, in this room. Despite how it looks, this story is just beginning. Do not be afraid. Be ready to respond. I know what it will look like. In my vision, I know what it will look like. Here in this time, I don't know what it will look like. I don't know how it will turn out. But in this moment, what I do know is that we are the ones to carry the Jesus story on, to teach it and finish it. That is the message of this story at the end of Mark's gospel. From a storm on the sea in the beginning of the gospel to an empty tomb at the end, this is the story. The question is, will we be able sufficiently to overcome our fear and hear the story and respond to the ending of Mark's gospel story in a way that is different from how the women responded to that young man? Let me say it again. This is our empty tomb moment. This is our time to hear the angelic message. Despite what you see, Jesus is out there in front of you. You go find him. And when you have found him, you finish his story. Amen.